craziness that we see during the Seattle summertime, and you've also got yourself aboard the Spirit of Seattle, the flagship. So I think you guys did very, very well for yourself. Now, the first thing I want to point out, now that we've gotten all that introduction out of the way, is going to be along the waterfront. We're going to be talking about the waterfront area for the first part of the tour. We'll make a little loop around to the Outer Bay areas, and then end up over in the shipyard area, talk a little bit more about the maritime industry. Starting off with the waterfront, we just leave out of Pier 55, and those numbers just keep on going up as you cut across to the north side of the bay. Pier 56, nice place to eat if you're thinking about places to go after the tour today. You got Elliott's Oyster House, nice sit-down place to grab a bite to eat. A little further up, got Pier 57, the Great Seattle Wheel. This one's really hard to miss. It's 175 feet, and it stands atop of Miners Landing. That's the name of the pier beyond just being called Pier 57, although the name isn't entirely accurate, because the name is in reference to the steamship Portland coming into town with reportedly over a ton of gold on it. Now, this really kicked off the Klondike Gold Rush, and it didn't actually happen at Pier 57 much as they would like you to think that it did. It actually happened in between where the wheel is and the Pier 59, the Seattle Aquarium. As we pass by, though, you're going to notice that there is no pier there. There is no Pier 58. You were here a couple of years ago, there was a Pier 58, but not anymore, because back in 2019, Pier 58 was a very old pier, and that's when it all came crashing down. It was very sad to see because we lost a good portion of our history. Thankfully, nobody was injured when this actually happened. But we want to restore part of that history, and that's what this barge with the big red crane on it is working on. You can even see some of the piling sticking out and some of the early paves of walkways that is eventually going to be the new waterfront part of Pier 58. Now, Pier 58 is going to have that walkway, but also have a bridge that goes directly over the top of the almost 8-lane highway that is Alaskan Way. You guys probably had to dodge and weave and play Frogger in order to cross over in the first place. And it's going to go all the way over to our other biggest tourist attraction here at the waterfront, Pike Place Market. How many of you folks have already been to Pike Place Market? Okay, a good portion of you guys. Let me ask you a slightly tougher question. How many of you folks, with your hands up, have been to all 5 levels of Pike Place Market? Oh, I don't see any hands. That's always a shame. I always find that most people who board this tour only stick to that top level, the street level of Pike Place Market, and if you just do that, you're missing 80% of the market. So head on back to Pike Place and check out some of the lower levels where you can find some of my personal favorite shops, get lost in the labyrinth of all the different local shops that they have available there. Oftentimes they'll have plaques on the walls telling you how long their families have been there, and you can bet it's going to be multiple generations. So head on back and check out some of my personal favorite stores. There's an old school record shop, a really fun comic book store with all sorts of like nerdy memorabilia, some really fun stuff you can check out over there. All that's going to be available on some of those lower levels. So head on back to Pike Place, and you can even go back with a little bit more knowledge as to how Pike Place was formed in the first place. Pike Place was started all the way back in 1907. Idea of meeting the producers. Basically, Seattle was having a big problem. If you remember during that Klondike Gold Rush that I talked about a little earlier, we were known for mining the miners, basically. Because everybody who was coming to the town at the time, we would have to sell them supplies, and then a bunch of companies caught on and they realized that they could gouge up prices. They were starting to gouge up prices of produce to the point where onions, a single pound of onions, would run you about $29 and some change for a single pound of onions here in Seattle. That's pretty ridiculous, and nobody in the city wanted to pay it. So they banded together and asked the farmers to come out and form Pike Place Market. And as you can tell, it worked out pretty well. It's been running strong. It's one of the biggest markets for over 100 years. And it also competes with the Space Needle for the most photographed place in all of Washington State. If anyone just heard that horn go off, we can look over to the left side and see that the Washington State Ferry is currently coming into dock. There's actually the one a little further along the waterfront there. Those Washington State Ferries are paramount to how we bring people around throughout the city because of the water that we're traveling on right now. It may come to surprise you, but the water that we're traveling on right now is all part of Elliott Bay. And Elliott Bay's average depth, especially when you go further out into that sound area, is about 600 feet of depth. To give you an idea of how deep that is, it is as deep as the Space Needle is tall. You can take the Space Needle out and drop it into Puget Sound and almost entirely disappear depending on where you take it. So not likely we're going to be building any bridges anytime soon. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense from an engineering perspective. Engineers have actually calculated it out that if you wanted to build a bridge out here in the Sound, especially going out to Bainbridge, which we can see over there to the left, just underneath those beautiful mountains, that's going to run you about a mile for every single piling that you would have to create. 1 mile for all those pilings. That's pretty ridiculous. So not going to be seeing any bridges being built anytime soon. That in the prevailing maritime industry doesn't allow us to sort of copy our homework on the 520 bridge or the I-90 bridge of the floating bridges that go up and down with the tide. Speaking of different types of vessels, we're actually seeing a little bit of an absent time for the vessels off here to the right. Normally, this whole area that we see off here to the right with all these multicolored buildings and these sort of airport terminals that connect to the water, these would be completely taken up by one singular massive ship. They're all called cruise ships. I'm sure we've seen them a couple times, especially if you're from a place like Miami or Fort Lauderdale. The other two titans of the cruise ship industry, we happen to be just the runner-up, placed third, just underneath them as far as busiest cruise ships in the entire country, which is pretty surprising because we only operate about 6 months out of the entire year, because most of these cruise ships kind of repeat Seattle's history and head all the way up to Alaska. Lots of people are very interested in that, just not during the winter time, when Alaska is not nearly the hot spot that it could be during the summertime. So we don't see a whole lot of cruise ships during this winter time, but normally during the summer it'll be pretty crazy, to the point where this one cruise ship terminal that we built all the way back in the early 2000s just was not enough. We ended up having to build 2 more, and they're even slated to build 2 more on top of that, able to house up to 5 cruise ships. We can only hold 3 right now, which is pretty crazy because up during the summer when I was working last year, I saw up to 6 in port, which means that 3 of them had to sit out in the middle of the bay and wait their turn. Speaking of nice places to stay while you're in the city, this is going to be your best location off here to the right. If you notice, there's a big red E on top of this building with a seagull landing on it just now. This whole area is called the Edgewater Hotel. It's all part of the pier, and it's quite a unique hotel. You literally cannot build a hotel like this today. It's kind of an object of its own time. It was built all the way back in 1962, and if you know your Seattle history, that's the same time the Space Needle was going up. And that was not a coincidence. They wanted to get some of that foot traffic of the people coming to the World's Fair. The World's Fair was projected to bring in about 10 million people, so we were seeing a whole lot of people coming to Seattle during that time, and the Edgewater wanted to get some of that foot traffic. However, despite the World's Fair being 6 whole months in length, Edgewater brought in 0 of the people from the World's Fair, not a single one, and that is because it is very difficult to build a hotel out on the edge of the water. And like I said, the World's Fair was 6 months in length, but they ended up opening their doors 3 weeks after everyone had already left from the World's Fair. Really disappointing for the Edgewater. They missed out on a ton of potential revenue and were actually almost going bankrupt until they were saved in 1964 when a famous rock band ended up staying in there. Does anyone here want to be brave and guess what famous rock band stayed in there in 1964? I heard it a couple of times. I heard it again, the Beatles. That is exactly right. The Beatles did stay there in 64, and they took that iconic photo that you guys have all probably seen of them fishing out the side of the window. This photo was published by Life magazine and circulated all over the world. Everybody saw that you could fish at the Edgewater and thought, that's crazy, I definitely want to try that. The only problem was then people started fishing at the Edgewater Hotel, and that was a horrific time for a lot of people working and staying at the Edgewater Hotel. Because if you're a guest down on the bottom floor and your upstairs neighbor happens to be an avid fisherman, prime time for fishing is very early in the morning, about 5 o'clock a.m. So now your wake-up call has just transformed into the sound of a 10-pound salmon slapping its way all the way up to the 3rd floor, waking everybody up on the way to